What are the entry requirements for each state and territory in Australia for international students? So in this video, we will talk about the entry requirements to enter into Australia and for each state and territory. So without wasting time, let's go straight to the topic. Now, first thing first, then when you're entering in Australia, there are some common requirements that you must meet, which are pretty standard for every single international student who's coming to Australia. So what are these requirements? First thing first, you must have a valid visa to enter Australia. The second thing will be that you are eligible to come to Australia without needing to apply for an exemption, which is if you are a student visa holder, you are eligible to enter in Australia without needing to apply for an exemption. Have a negative report of COVID-19 PCR test within 72 hours of your flight. Must be fully vaccinated with a TGA approved vaccine, must carry an international COVID-19 vaccine certificate, and must complete an Australian travel declaration, which must be completed 72 hours before your flight time and not earlier than 7 days before your flight. So these are the basic requirements that everyone must meet in order to enter into Australia. Now, as you know that each state and territory have their own restrictions, own border permit systems, and so on. So we are going to discuss that with each state and territory in this video. So let's go with the first state, which is New South Wales. So students can enter into New South Wales without needing to apply for any travel exemption. When you arrive in New South Wales, at the moment, you will need to do 72 hours of self-isolation.
And as we were finalizing this video, a news update came along which said that New South Wales and Victoria are removing the 72-hour isolation requirement for international arrivals, which means that people who are arriving in New South Wales and Victoria from 21st of December 2021 will no longer be required to isolate for 72 hours. So instead of that, what they need to do, they will need to be tested within 24 hours of their arrival and isolate until they receive a negative result. So the only isolation is for the time you're waiting for your test result, and if it turns negative, you can come out of your isolation. No more 72-hour isolation for people arriving in New South Wales and Victoria from 21st of December 2021.
And the good thing is you can do this quarantine at your home. So when it comes to testing for New South Wales, you must get tested within 24 hours of your arrival in New South Wales and after day 6 of your arrival in New South Wales. So you need to do at least 2 tests when you arrive in New South Wales. However, the good thing with the New South Wales is you don't need to apply for any border permit when arriving into New South Wales. So there is no additional form for New South Wales you will need to complete when arriving in New South Wales. The next state is Victoria. So students can enter into Victoria without needing to apply for any travel exemption. But again, there is a 72-hour self-isolation requirement that you must meet.
And as we mentioned earlier, New South Wales and Victoria are removing the 72-hour isolation requirement. The only requirement will be to isolate until you receive a negative result of your COVID-19 test, which you are required to do within 24 hours of arrival.
Home quarantine is certainly a possibility as long as you don't share any facilities with other people in the household. Now, you will be required to do your COVID-19 test within 24 hours of your arrival in Victoria, and you will need to do another COVID-19 testing between day 5 and day 7 after arriving. The Victorian government requires every international traveller to complete an international passenger arrival permit on their arrival into Victoria. So please make sure you complete this form before your arrival into Victoria. Now the next one is Queensland. So the million-dollar question is, can students enter into Queensland right now? The answer is yes. But there is a requirement for international students that they must do 14 days of hotel quarantine at their own cost if they are directly arriving into Queensland at the moment. And the cost of that 14-day hotel quarantine is around $3,200. So it's quite an expensive affair in this case. But the good news with Queensland is once it reached 90% of double dose vaccination, it will allow international travelers to come into Queensland without needing to do any quarantine. And the question is, when is Queensland expected to reach that 90% vaccination milestone? And the answer is, it will be happening sometime around 21st to 26th of January. and the government will announce the date when the international travelers can arrive into Queensland without needing to do any quarantine. So we will wait for an update from a Queensland government on that. However, there is another way you can come into Queensland, which is through interstate. So if you arrive in, let's say, in New South Wales or Victoria, then you will need to stay minimum of 14 days in these states. But there are obviously requirements even for interstate travelers into Queensland. Now, if you are entering into Queensland directly, you will be required to undertake COVID-19 testing in your hotel quarantine on the day 5 and day 12 or day 13 of your quarantine, even if you have no symptoms. And if you're entering into Queensland, you must complete a Queensland International Arrivals registration as well. It's another border permit that you will need to apply for entering into Queensland. Regardless whether you're entering directly into Queensland or through some other state or territory, you must complete this form. The next one is South Australia. So students can enter into South Australia, but again, there are quarantine requirements when you are entering into South Australia at the moment. So there is a 7-day quarantine that you must complete when you're arriving in South Australia. You can complete this quarantine at your own facility or own accommodation if you have one, or you can do it in a Medi hotel. So the cost of quarantine for a single person at the moment is around $2,500. It's another expensive exercise if you are doing your quarantine in a Medi hotel. But if you can arrange your own accommodation, you can do your quarantine in your own accommodation as well. And you will be required to undertake a COVID-19 test as well. The first one should be done within 24 hours of your arrival, and another test should be on day 6 and day 13 after arrival. And you also must do a daily symptom check for 14 days after arrival using Health Check South Australia app. Now, to enter into South Australia, you must complete their border permit as well. It's known as Entry Check South Australia or Entry Check SA. The next state is Tasmania. And so students can enter into Tasmania from 15th of December as well. But there is a very specific condition that you must come through New South Wales or Victoria when entering into Tasmania. You cannot enter into Tasmania directly at the moment as an international student. There is a specific requirement that you should come through New South Wales or Victoria. So you need to transit through either of these states. However, there are no specific requirements for quarantining when you're entering Tasmania from New South Wales or Victoria. And when it comes to testing, you must complete a COVID-19 test within 24 hours of your arrival in Tasmania. In order to enter into Tasmania, you must also complete a border permit, which is known as TAS e-Travel. So you'll have to apply for a border permit through this website. The next one is ACT, Australian Capital Territory. So again, students can arrive into Australian Capital Territory. You will need to complete 3 days of self-isolation when arriving into ACT. Please note that when you're arriving in ACT, your arrival date will be considered as day 0. So if you're arriving today, you will not count today in your isolation. You'll have to do 3 days after today. Again, you can do home quarantine as well, as long as you have a separate facilities and you're not sharing anything with other household members. And COVID testing is required within 24 hours of your arrival and on day 6 after your arrival as well. Now, there is a form known as declaration form that you must complete when you're entering into ACT. The next one is Western Australia. At the moment, it is very complicated to enter into Western Australia. The only state at the moment in Australia where you can enter into Western Australia from is Tasmania with very less restrictions. All other states or territories are either banned for entry or have a very high number of restrictions when entering into Western Australia. Ideally, it will be better for you to wait until they reopen the borders. Now, the good news is the Western Australian Premier has already declared that 5th of February is the date when international travelers can arrive into Western Australia without needing to do any quarantine. So that is a positive news, and hopefully students can start coming back to Western Australia from that day onwards. So as from 5th of February onwards, there won't be any requirements to do any quarantine, but when it comes to testing, you will be required to take a test within 48 hours of your arrival in Western Australia and another one on day 6 as well. And for everyone entering into Western Australia, will be required to complete a declaration form which is known as G2G Pass Declaration. So it is quite complicated at the moment to enter into Western Australia, but we are hoping that from 5th of February onwards, that will be easier. Now last but not the least is Northern Territory. At the moment, the entry into Northern Territory for international students is not allowed, but it is happening quite soon. So from 20th of December onwards, there are no restrictions when it comes to international arrivals into Northern Territory. There won't be any restrictions on quarantining and so on, but you will be required to undertake a PCR test within 72 hours of your arriving, and another one on day 6 as well. And to enter into Northern Territory, you will be required to complete a form which is known as border entry form, that you can complete it on their website as well. Now it does seem very complicated, isn't it? So to make things easier for you, we have created this blog post that where we have this Excel spreadsheet that gets updated regularly, where we have all these details about quarantine requirements, any entry requirements, any border permits, COVID testing information for each state and territory. And then we try to update this on a regular basis so you get an up-to-date information within this Excel spreadsheet. So what I suggest you to do is bookmark this page and come and check this page regularly so you get up-to-date information on what's happening with each state and territory and the requirements to entry, COVID-19 testing, border permits, and so on. We also got a link for each government website as well. So if you would like to get an instant notification from the government website, we highly recommend you to bookmark those links as well. So hopefully that will be much easier to keep a track on what's happening with each state and territory and what are their requirements for entry as well. And it took us plenty of time to create this spreadsheet. We had to go through with different websites and so on. And if you do find any value in that spreadsheet or in that blog post, please make sure to share it with your friends as well. It helps us to reach more people and hopefully it helps your friends as well. And if you find this information useful, please make sure to like, share and subscribe as well. And thanks for watching. See you in the next one.